Ladies and gentlemen, drivers, gig workers, and everyone in between, welcome to This Week in Rideshare podcast. I'm your host, Jared Hoffa. It is Friday, December 20th, and this week, a startup gets empowered, drivers fight lockouts, and Waymo takes the lead. LegalRideshare breaks it down. And from LegalRideshare, I'm joined by the co-founder and lead attorney, Brian Green. Bryant, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, Jared. It's a little snowy here in Chicago.
Yeah, I got caught in the snow last night. I was heading home, and I don't know if you were out, but man, we got bombed here last night. It seems to have melted, though, so hopefully the roads aren't too bad today in Chicago.
Yeah, no, I drove in actually, and they're a little slippery. So hopefully everybody stays safe out there. Be careful, drive slow. Hope everybody gets to their destination in a safe way.
Exactly. You don't want to get into an accident a couple days before Christmas. That would be pretty terrible.
Yes, agreed.
So we're going to jump into stories this week. As always, pretty interesting stuff and new developments, which I love. Starting with the first story this week. Uber has a new rival, and it's actually using Uber's own playbook. And this is from New York Times. And they reported, quote, founded in 2019, the ride-hailing startup Empower has become a serious rival to Uber and Lyft in Washington. It now does over 100,000 rides in the city each week, which is good for about 10% of the local market. But the company has refused to register with Mr. Rogers' agency, meaning that it operates in the city illegally. Now, while drivers and riders have taken to Empower because it has cheap rides, its rapid growth has been met with mounting legal troubles. In fact, the startup has racked over $100 million in unpaid fines. It's being investigated by the council and has been sued by the D.C. Attorney General's office. To some regulators, Empower's tactics are more than just familiar. They're a page out of Uber's playbook when it arrived in Washington a decade ago. So I'm really torn with this, Bryant. When I first heard about Empower, it seemed pretty great, but I mean, it's using Uber's rules, so I don't know if this is going to end well.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple ways to look at this. First of all, I like that there's competition. I think Uber and Lyft need to be kept honest, and that happens through competition in the market, through other innovators who are looking to give riders and drivers something that Uber and Lyft won't, which is perhaps better pay for drivers, cheaper rides for riders. There's a lot of ways in which rideshare can be made better, and we've seen dozens of startups pop up around the country trying to fill those holes and just make rideshare a better experience. So I like the idea that we've got competition to push Uber and Lyft to do better and perhaps really become a major player in the market themselves. The other thing that we do need to talk about, however, is the tactics in which these other companies like Empower are coming into fruition. Uber and Lyft started their journeys more than a decade ago now, and they broke all the rules. They really broke the system, and the local markets were not ready for what was happening. They didn't have the rules in place to regulate the TNPs. They didn't have the rules in place to ensure that the companies didn't just bulldoze their way through. And here we are today. The taxi industry is essentially gone. Uber and Lyft have taken over, but the cities have gotten smarter. They have rules in place. They know what the potential issues are when companies step into the market, and they want to be able to regulate them so that they're protecting consumers, protecting the local pedestrians and vehicular traffic, and dozens of other concerns that they may have. So I'm thinking that the cities are going to come down hard on these new entities, and while they're taking a lesson from Uber and Lyft and playing out of their playbook, so to speak, I think that the local governments have learned a lot and are not going to give them the same deference that they gave Uber and Lyft so many years ago.
Yeah, I actually just had this conversation yesterday. Or a couple days ago, I was at an AI conference, and it's exactly what you said about this whole industry, especially the rideshare industry. It's sort of the fool me once. I don't think 10 years ago, like you said, this was disruptive technology that Uber did and disrupted the markets. They weren't ready for it. They're not going to fall for this twice. So, it's great. Like you said, I think it's great that these rides are cheaper, and I'm sure the drivers probably make more on this, which is all great stuff. But there's no way that these cities, especially DC, is going to just let $100 million in unpaid fines go through. I can't imagine that they're just going to be able to keep doing it, because if they let them go, then other startups are going to do the same thing. And it then can just become a hot mess. This article doesn't, I don't know if you know more about this. In the article, doesn't also even discuss how the insurance policies work or how the coverage works. Do you know anything about that with Empower?
Well, I don't know specifically about Empower, but I can tell you that the reason why these rules exist is because the cities have learned what the pitfalls are when rideshare companies come into town and are not properly regulated. And that has to do with insurance. That has to do with proving that they're doing the right kinds of background checks. There's all sorts of checks that each one of these companies that wants to operate in a city needs to fulfill. And if they don't fulfill it, they can't operate. So we want to make sure that a rideshare company that's doing as many rides as Empower is doing has the appropriate insurance and is going through the necessary safety checks. Just because the cities didn't regulate before when Uber and Lyft showed up doesn't mean that they're not going to regulate now. Like I said earlier, the cities learned a lot through the debacle that was the early days of Uber and Lyft, and they're protecting their consumers based on what they have learned. So as you said, fool me once, shame on you. They're not going to be fooled again. I can't speak as to what Empower is doing or not doing in terms of their business model. We don't, they're relatively new. We don't have them in Chicago, but they should have to follow the same rules that everybody else follows, which is meeting certain safety and financial guidelines so as to protect the people that they're serving.
Right, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about this more probably in the next couple of weeks as the story grows. I'm seeing a lot more articles about Empower. I never really heard of Empower before, so yeah, I'm sure we'll be covering it in the future. Heading into the second story, we've talked about a few times before, but good just to get some updates. Drivers are continuing to fight New York City lockouts, and this is from New York Times, and they reported one driver. His name is Amadou, 38, is one of the many drivers who say the lockouts have severely affected his take-home pay. He said he's been driving full-time for Uber and Lyft for 4 years. He said he used to make about $350 on a given day before expenses, but is now making less than $200 during such shifts because of the lockouts. The Taxi and Limousine Commission, the city agency that oversees the rideshare companies, plans to amend the driver pay law earlier next year to prevent the companies from engaging in lockouts. As the city mulls over how it will adjust the law, unions that represent drivers have made their demands clear, and so have Uber and Lyft. The Independent Drivers Guild, which represents about 80,000 for-hire drivers in New York City, demanded this week that the city increase the amount of available work by limiting the pool of new Uber and Lyft drivers, which the union believes would end the lockout. So this is the first time, at least that I've seen, that it sounds like we had discussed this a couple weeks ago, that clearly the lockouts aren't going to last. There's going to be some retaliation. So it looks like the government stepping in, at least the Tax and Limousine Commission stepping in first, and Independent Drivers Guild, which we also work with pretty closely. So, Brian, it does seem like there's actual legitimate pushback now on these lockouts.
Yeah, I'm glad to see, because the lockouts are obviously a loophole that was not intended when they were passing the rules about driver pay and driver benefits. So Uber and Lyft had found this loophole to curb their expenses once drivers in New York were going to be paid more than in many other markets. Drivers have obviously been negatively affected by it. So I'm glad to see that the government is stepping in and trying to curb what's going on, because the intention was that drivers had better access and were paid higher wages and had a better quality of work and essentially life. With the lockouts, none of that is coming to fruition. So, we've talked before about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and it's very clear that the current state with the lockouts is not living up to the spirit of the law. So luckily there's government that's stepping in. Luckily there's groups like Independent Drivers Guild who are advocating on behalf of the drivers. And I'd like to see at the beginning of next year that there are really positive steps to effectuating the benefits that drivers have earned and are entitled to by the spirit of the law and soon to be by the letter of the law.
Yeah, and I really like IDG's proposal here. All this stuff can get very complicated and in the weeds, and there's obviously caveats. But it seems like one of the easy solutions here is don't punish the drivers that are already there. Just limit the amount of new drivers. Basically, have a queue set up. So it's if they hit X threshold in New York City, you can apply for Uber or Lyft, but you can't get on. I mean, I think that would be the simplest way than affect. First off, just lock everyone out, which is insane. I just think that's a good move. So I'm curious to see how Uber Lyft responds. They did not. I don't think in this article they had any feedback or what any. I don't know if they reached out to Uber or Lyft, but this can't keep going on because this is just disastrous. And we even saw from a couple weeks ago, these sort of lockouts will also they just sort of skyrocketing prices and wait times. Nothing about this is consistent or good.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Having a set number of drivers makes sense from a business standpoint on both ends. There's less competition than for the drivers who are on the platform. It makes it easier for Uber and Lyft to predict the number of drivers who they're going to have to pay. And in every other profession, really, there's a set number of people. The market kind of bears out how many people can work in a certain field. At a company, there's just not endless hiring. The better drivers are the ones who have been there for the longer period of time, deserve to stay on the platform and be able to maintain their careers. And as they decide to retire or switch to a different career path, then an opportunity can arise for the next person in queue. So I think that's a smart way to handle it. Obviously, there's going to be some kinks that need to be worked out along the way and figure out how to best effectuate that plan. But I think it's a good concept.
Yeah, we'll see. I agree, and I think there's a smart proposal by IDG, which we work with pretty closely. So kudos to them. I'm glad people are stepping up and giving pushback. And of course, we can't end the week without talking about robotaxis. And in fact, it's been a pretty rough week for robotaxis, but not for Waymo. This is from The Verge, and they reported, quote, chief among those is the number 4 million, which is how many driverless rides in the company provided in the 3 cities which it operates, Phoenix, San Francisco, and LA. Waymo says it has provided a total of 5 million driverless rides in its 3 key markets, which means nearly all of its growth took place this year alone. The fact that Waymo has facilitated 4 million trips in 3 cities while only serving 1 airport is pretty amazing and could speak to the company's future prospects as its technology continues to mature. Airports are a major source of revenue for human-powered ride-hail companies like Uber and Lyft. Now, they also mention here safety is a big hurdle. While Waymo has published a number of studies that indicate its vehicles are safer than human drivers, there are still a lot of lingering questions around passenger safety. Waymo vehicles have been targeted for harassment and vandalism, and they have occasionally come into conflict with emergency vehicles. So, I mean, what a whirlwind year, Brian. It felt like, we said robotaxis are 5 years off, and now we have one company who's already cranked out 4 million trips in under a year. Wild stuff.
That's an astounding number. I didn't have any idea that we were at that level and how many people were using Waymo in these markets. I obviously understood that this was an up and coming industry. I understood that people were opting often for the driverless car over the Uber and Lyft with the driver. But to hear and see that number, 4 million this year, 5 million total, wow, that's substantial. We're seeing the technology come in at a very fast speed. We're seeing that the technology is not going anywhere, and with companies like Waymo pushing through these major markets, and certainly I would expect that we're going to see them in other big cities soon, likely Chicago and others. We just have to keep monitoring safety and ensuring that the technology is as effective as the company says. Companies like LegalRideshare are in place to hold the companies like Waymo and other autonomous vehicle operators accountable for when mistakes happen. The only way for this technology to improve is to, one, have good data as to exactly, how often mishaps happen, and when mishaps do occur, ensure that the company is held accountable for injuries and damages that they cause.
Yeah, this is the first article, at least one of the few that I've actually read, where they do discuss safety. A lot of this has just been about kind of a lot of like deployment. A lot of the articles we've discussed are about deployment, the actual Waymos on the streets, and the other is like weird technical glitches. This is one of the first where they're starting to sight in on safety, and especially some of the issues which we've seen where the cars themselves get vandalized, and there's a passenger in the back, or we've seen that video where a passenger's in the back seat and the car just sort of took off and they couldn't get out of it. So you're right, and the safety is going to start becoming a central focus, which obviously is what we focus on. But yeah, I knew it was doing a lot of rides, but it's officially 5 million driverless rides in only 3 markets with 1 airport. I mean, that is some serious mileage. It's also going to be interesting when they start deploying even more of these Waymos, if they interact with each other in a positive way or create more congestion. I don't know. It's so early, but it's something you can't dismiss. That's for sure.
Yeah, once you see that number, the 5 million, we have to start talking about safety. I think before people were a bit in awe of the technology itself. Wow, this is a cool feature. Wow, I can't believe this is the future of rideshare and transportation. And then you see 5 million rides and you start thinking, this isn't the future, this is the now. So how are we going to ensure that this is done in the right way where people are safe, people are getting from point A to point B without concern of injury or people getting hurt outside the vehicle, whether that's pedestrians, other motorists, bicyclists, you name it. Once you have the reality of how many rides they're doing, we have to put safety at the forefront.
Oh yeah, I mean that's just an insane number. So absolutely, and well said. I think that is obviously the next step and hopefully that becomes a key focus. Not just like you said, hey, this is really cool. It's the future. Like you said, it's now, and that's a big part of what happens with any vehicle on the road, collisions and accidents. So that's our stories for this week. So as always, Brian, I'll give you the final say before we head off into the weekend.
Yeah, just reminding everybody to have a safe weekend. If you do find yourself in an accident or injured on the roadway, do not hesitate to call Legal Rideshare. We are the first law firm in the United States entirely dedicated to Uber, Lyft, and other gig-related accident and injury claims. We help drivers, passengers, victims, anybody who's injured on the roadway. We can help put money in your pocket for medical bills, lost wages, pain and suffering, anything else that you lose as a result of it. So please contact us right away. Time is of the essence. LegalRideshare.com is the best way to get in touch with us.
Thank you, Brian. And as I like to say, that is the end of this week in Rideshare. See you next week.